Unconventional Life, the show where we are on a mission to inspire and empower people to live a life by their own design. This is your host, Jules Schroeder. Today's segment, we have got a powerhouse. Emily Joy Rosen is the director and co-owner of the Institute for Psychology of Eating, an institute that intersects science, psychology, nutrition, and soul, literally having hundreds of thousands of students go through their program. And Emily herself reaches millions of people online, also through her writing, and is the founder of Secret Keepers. We've got all kinds of goodies in store for you all today. Let's go ahead and go on inside. Unconventional Life, I have got Emily Joy Rosen here joining us today in Boulder, Colorado. Take us back, you've had all these different successes, all these accomplishments at quite a young age. And if we were to see who you were growing up, a fly on the wall through grade school or even high school, what would we have seen?
I'm so glad we can't actually go back. I can tell whatever story I want. No, I mean, it's interesting because I know the unconventional life, and I was thinking about that phrase, and I feel like I've always had that. My parents were definitely living outside of maybe more normal cultural paradigms. I was homeschooled most of my life. So in middle school, you would have seen me in some type of experience in my house, and was raised macrobiotic. And my parents were entrepreneurs, even though they didn't use that term. They just worked for themselves, and they worked together. And so my model growing up was essentially unconventional, but I did not know any different. Yeah. And I kind of had this reverse experience where I did opt to go to high school. I went to a private prep school and really got indoctrinated into that kind of hierarchical way of living. And you accomplish this, and then you go on to this, and then you go on to this. And so I didn't really find that until like 16, 17, 18. Mm-hmm. And then kind of return back to, let's say, a more unconventional way of living later on in my life.
Yeah. And one of the things that I love about your story, that it's actually your writing that has really become a platform. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Emily's work, she does these really lengthy prose, form of poetry. And it's amazing the level of vulnerability and depth that you get. And I think, one of the things of why I love our show so much is we really get to explore who is the human behind all the accolades. What's this person really like? And to be able to write and channel in that way, I imagine you've had your fair story of life experience.
Yeah, life has certainly kicked my bum quite a few times. But I didn't start out even as a writer or thinking in any way that I was a writer. I mean, I grew up reading the classics and the greats, and so I just never identified in that way. And then went to art school, left art school because I graduated, but at the end of art school, I stopped painting in large part due to the fact that I developed a really serious eating disorder. And I was practically non-functional, but I did not want to ask for help, which tends to be a pattern for me. And so instead of asking for help, I went back to school for nutrition and learned about nutrition, started working in that industry. And I found it wasn't not only not helping me that much, but also not helping my clients. That led me to go to study psychology. So like my professional life is a lot of times just been a reflection of trying to fix myself.
So Emily talks about how her eating disorder was fuel not only for how she launched the Institute for Psychology of Eating, but how it was also fuel for her own growth and being oriented to growth. And I get asked so often, when I think about the experiences that I've gone through, what's appropriate to share? And should I even bring that to somebody? And you take someone like Emily, where literally not only is it appropriate for her to share, it's how she birthed her whole thing. And so it's something you have to ask yourself. What part of you are you unwilling to let be seen? What part of you are you unwilling to let be heard? And are you willing to just come to terms with we're all human. We all deal with stuff. We all go through things, and we all struggle. And I find that when you let go of that personal attachment, that it's just yours, that it actually is universal, that it's actually something that can be transmuted by your own ability and willingness to sit with it, that can actually provide healing and quantum growth and acceleration for everyone.
And people are like, what was your plan of action? And that's so amazing. This makes so much sense that you did all of these different degrees and got these counseling certifications. And I was like, I was just trying to understand why I felt this way all the time. And then even with the Institute for the Psychology of Eating, I just so believed in the work that we were doing. And it was really the perfect marriage of my own personal journey and wanting to help others, but being able to be a little bit more behind the scenes.
Yeah.
That I started studying digital marketing and building online systems and platforms, not because I ever set out to learn that stuff or because I had some kind of career goals around it or it was on my non-existent vision board, but because it was what I needed to do in service to what I wanted to create.
Yeah, and I like you touching on that, and I think a lot of our audience can relate to that.
Mm-hmm.
It's the very thing that you want to learn or the thing that you want to discover in yourself that is the thing that sets you on the path. And much of my life with this show, I never felt like I truly fit in. I've always had multiple passions, and so this unconventional life has been this pursuit of my own reflection of acceptance and my own reflection of having the permission to live more fully and more from a place of passion. And so with the stuff that you're doing, it was kind of conventional in some of the ways. Like you went, to the traditional schools, you got the education.
Even though in my world, going to art school was like, they were like, really? That's not like a real degree. And I was like, yes, it is. I went to Rhode Island School of Design. I have a bachelor's in printmaking, which I use absolutely never. I'm glad I have it.
Yeah, and you checked all the boxes.
I did.
And then, there have been several moments though through that it's one thing to check the boxes, but then to actually create and innovate, which in so many ways you're an innovator. What was the turning point when you really went from following this conventional model into more of this unconventional path?
I think when you start to follow your passions and you get trained in them and then you create, career objectives out of them, one of the things that makes it pretty easy is like often you're talking to yourself, right? Like, so I was the client. I was the person that I was trying to serve. And so I just imagined what I would want my experience to be like and then kind of figured it out. And then by one click of one button on the internet, happened to land up at a digital marketing conference and learned it was an entire industry, and I was like, oh my God, there's people out here doing this, And so I've always had a voracious appetite for learning, at times like compulsive, I'll be frank. And I'll give my parents credit for a lot of it because work was our religion. Like we were very much raised to value hard work. And so I've never been shy of that. And on top of that, I never was, my parents were always like, find something that you love that contributes in some way and you will be able to make a life. And so I didn't have a different perspective on that. I will say I was so dysfunctional for so much of my 20s that at some point they were like, okay, you might need to get like a normal job. And I did work at Whole Foods bagging groceries for years because I was just like, this whole thing of trying to figure it out when I can barely even like function through my day felt overwhelming. But that voice was always there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So 2 things in what you've said. One, I think you're such an artist at community building. Like you said, 9 years ago, before we had the Facebook platform and Snapchat and Instagram and Pinterest and like so many of these communities. Yeah. It's like you really pioneered it. And I think for a lot of those that are tuning in, you hear building that community, building the audience. It's like one of the, essential building blocks.
Totally.
And so what advice could you share in, your journey of what worked then, but ultimately what's working now?
Yeah.
That you feel like someone that's maybe getting in or been doing it for a while that they should hear?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because the platforms change, the algorithms change, the ways of distribution change, but the actual core underpinnings are always the same, right? Like attention is our number one commodity. Getting people to pay attention to you in the first place, like you have to garner attention in some regard, and ideally you're doing it through an ethical way that actually captures people's imagination or inspires them in a very natural and organic way. And then from there, it's usually educating and informing and connecting. I mean, it's just the fundamentals of like, if you moved into a new neighborhood, you would go and either knock on people's doors and introduce yourself and offer something of value like a banana bread, or, you would host a party and you would invite people to the party and then you would get them a taste of who you are and probably offer them something so they had a good experience. And so it's the same thing online.
I love that Emily is talking about community building. When I first started the Unconventional Life 2 years ago, it literally was born out of a desire to tell stories. I just wanted to tell stories of people like you, me, my peers that were out there doing it differently, saying no to the 9 to 5 to pursue a life that they love. And what I've seen in the last 2 years, we've literally impacted millions of people from 75 different countries, that strategies are important, but they're not everything. And if I've learned anything, especially hearing Emily's segment, she was doing just what was natural. What was the thing that made sense? And so often in the business world, we get so swept up in someone else's opinion. But you actually have the ability, more than anybody else, to know your own compass and to know what's not just right for everyone, but what's right for you. So as we dive back into this segment, really taking that on as you listen to this next piece that we go into.
I built our institute completely organically off of Facebook in the very early days because I was like, so if we want to build a school on the internet, where are the people? And for me, I was a Facebook user very early days. I always liked social networks. So I just had a proclivity towards them from a very, right when I started. And I was like, this is so cool. I'm an introvert. So I was like, the idea of connecting with people without having to be face to face to them was divine for me. And I know for some people that's not like their chosen trajectory, but I was like, there are people here. And I was using Facebook Messenger well before, now there's Facebook Messenger ads, but I was using it to connect with people who looked like they would be interested in the stuff that I was selling, and really naturally I'd be like, hey, you've been talking about this on this page, or I saw you in this group and I want to share this thing that I think might be helpful to you. And I didn't even understand the concept of lead magnet or value offer. I just knew that if I knocked on someone's door and tried to sell them something, they would probably close the door in my face because I had closed the door in many people's faces over the years. So if I offered them something that solved a problem that they were facing or, added to a conversation they were already having, it just naturally built connection. It naturally built into the system like, oh, thank you. You're somebody who has something that I might need. And so before there was even ads available, I was doing that, producing content, sharing it, and then connecting with people because that's what made sense to me based on my experience of life.
Yeah. I like thinking about it like the banana bread is like your free ebook.
Totally.
It's like, what would you do to your neighbors?
Yeah.
Like, how would you meet someone online? And, I think underneath all of it, it's very intuitive and it's almost like logical. And so often we complicate it or we overthink it or we over strategize it. Like you said, there's so many terms and, places to identify these things. And, I think underneath it, your intuition has been a cornerstone, not only to the success with the Institute, but also through your writing, and I think why you've had the impact you've had. And so share with me a little bit, with us a little bit about your intuition, your relationship. Do you even use that word? Does that word resonate for you?
Well,
how do you perceive it?
I live in Boulder, so now I use that word a lot. And I hug people when I meet them, which I'm from Boston. So when I move home, I go back to where I grew up and people are like, what are you doing? I'm touching strangers and using vernacular they've never heard. I'm like, does this land for you when I say it? The essence, yeah. I call it a knowing. It's interesting. There's been many times in my life that for all intents and purposes, I have made very poor decisions. People would look at it and be like, what are you thinking? And it's usually driven by this sense of I just know. Romantically, I'm horrible at this, so I don't apply this in that regard, but just professionally, I've been really that when I listen to that, it's guided me in really beautiful places. And even when it hasn't necessarily been conventionally successful, it's been, and I know this sounds so trite, and when things fall apart and you fail, it's really hard to be like, what a great learning experience. But I have learned more from my failures, and I am very, very diligent with myself around stuff like that. Whether it's heartbreak or losing hundreds of thousands of dollars after an experience like that, I sit down and I make sure to extract every last piece of value. And I will say a lot of my writing comes from that place of I am hypersensitive, I am a bit compulsive, I am incredibly impacted, and I've struggled a lot of my life trying to navigate the world, which feels like people are acting like when things are unsaid, I'm like, excuse me, there's tension in the room, people are like, we're trying to do stuff, and I'm like, I can't breathe, So yeah. I've had a hard time navigating the kind of traditional paradigms of how we are supposed to be with others, and part of my process, and also my counseling training, was in the Socratic dialogue, which is essentially a series of questions that you ask yourself to kind of figure out what's going on for you underneath. I use that in business, I use that in relationships, I use that in my own internal process. I'm like, I am freaking out. Why? It's it's kind of a gentle question, you know, as opposed to stop freaking out. When I ask why, I'm able to learn so much more. And I think that's why people will say I do business kind of creatively. If you're an entrepreneur, you have to learn how to pivot fast.
Yeah.
You have to learn to be less precious. It's you have to learn to listen to what people say to you. It's really, talk about a personal development exercise. beyond anything I ever did in any workshop room, whether it was beating pillows or some like violent catharsis, like running a company with people who are customers talking to you all the time, and then your team with all their needs, and then you have your things, and then you're supposed to create and make. I mean, it's just, it expands your capacity beyond anything I could have imagined.
Yeah.
In a very real and tangible way. So intuition, knowing all of that, yes, and rigorous self-inventory. I am rigorous.
Yeah. And, you know, I like you touching on a few of the things. And I think what strikes me the most is just asking yourself the question, why?
Yeah.
Going a layer deeper. And this conventional model we've been, you know, taught for the most part, stuff it down, fight through it, push through, don't listen, keep going. And it's like totally the outdated. And when I look at the success that I've had as an entrepreneur, it's been by being able to have, you know, step one, even the awareness of like something doesn't feel right. And even though it looks right, it sounds right, it could be right, like intuitively, physically in my body, it doesn't feel right. And it's like the alarm system going off.
Loudly.
Yeah, and from that place, you know, I actually believe that if I'm onto something, it should in a lot of ways feel effortless. Not that effort isn't required and hard work isn't required, but when I'm encountering resistance again and again and again, it usually for me is feedback in a lot of ways to pivot.
Yeah.
And I like you mentioning that as well, is that as entrepreneurs, we do have to pivot. So give us a few of your best practices of what do you do that helps you with some of these nuances. And ultimately, you know, I think you're the queen of being able to take real life experience, whether it's like the eating disorder or the various other things, and really transmute them into art in a lot of ways. So give us a little bit of insight on both those things.
Well, I think just at like a core level, I think what's like most true for me is like growth is my orientation. Like when people like ask me what I value, like I like understanding and I like growing. So just that's like a foundation. Like if you don't, then will not be relevant. You know what I mean? Like I have people who in my life are just like, I just want to be comfortable. I just don't orient towards comfort. So I think that's just important to acknowledge. Day to day, and this is so simple, and it's even something we teach as it relates to eating psychology, my breath. I mean, the amount of times I feel like I'm dying and then I realize I haven't really breathed past my upper register is phenomenal. So coming back to my breath, breathing into my belly, where actually I think a lot of our intuition is anyways. Like in Japan, they make decisions, they talk about like the gut brain. We know we have an enteric nervous system. We know there's a lot of intelligence down here. We don't access it.
Yeah.
You know, and the breath pattern of anxiety and stress is that upper register short breath. And from that place, you are not going to make as clean of a decision. You're going to make survival-based decisions. You're going to make these snap choices that can obviously at times save your life or save your company, but overall that's really not a good place to live or make your decisions from. You just don't have access to that kind of higher knowing or that intrinsic like sense of is this right or wrong for me based on what's happening currently. The writing piece is interesting because when I was journaling for myself, I was not as rigorous. I was a little bit sloppy. I'd be like, yeah, I get the point. I kind of understand it. But then I would repeat the pattern. So to me, if there's a pattern repeating in my life, it's my job. Like the common denominator is me. Yeah. And I can get pretty damn habitual. So when I started kind of doing these self-reflecting exercises and then sharing them on Facebook, I found that I was being more discerning with myself. I was slowing down. And then I was having these profound connections and so many times, like what I'd be most terrified to share or most ashamed of, I would get an outpouring of people being like, I thought I was the only one. I had no idea there was somebody else who was like this. And it started to not only, it kind of felt like it was just healing me, but it also made these deeply personal things, some of which I was incredibly shameful about, not mine. It was like I released them into the space and then there was like these connections that were forming and I was healing and it was alchemizing the pain. It was just like, it felt like magic.
For so long in my life, I questioned if the story that I had to tell was actually valuable. Like, what is it that I have to say that would make someone or make someone like you be interested in my own opinion? And my music primarily has been the side of me that has been the most vulnerable and that piece to share. And just like how Emily talks about her poetry and her writing, that very thing, her commitment to that, birthed out of a challenge of, hey, can you put that out there? And accepting that invitation was the thing that took her to the next level. So it's important to remember that very thing inside of you that nobody could possibly see, that's the thing that's waiting for you. And it's the thing, if you're willing, that gentle knock that you hear deep in your belly, if you're willing to say yes to it, that's the very thing that'll catapult you to that very next level.
And then that's developed into more of like a poetry style and an art form, and I'm definitely like, have different ways that I play with it now, and it's become a whole world for me. But it really started out by someone saying like, don't you have anything to say? And then me experiencing like radical transformation and connection that I never imagined was possible.
Yeah. I love hearing the extent of that journey. And I think for our listeners too, each one of us has a gift that is deeply rooted inside of us. And same thing with my music and with my songwriting, where it's the thing that I feel the most resistant, the thing that I feel like is the worst song I've ever written and the most terrible video and that I absolutely couldn't share. And when shared, it transmutes and it becomes, ours. And I relate to it in a lot of ways being a channel or ultimately a conduit for these things to live out. So such great advice. So I'd love to end here with The Secret Keepers, which is what is coming next. And
new company.
Your
new
new baby.
I don't have children, so I just like birth businesses.
Your new baby. And I think in a lot of ways, one of the most edgiest new births for you in some ways. Like it's really Emily unscripted. Like it's the raw, human, softer, gentler parts of you.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. Secret Keepers is, for me, the things that I value most, that I'm most drawn to pretty consistently are art and in some way contributing and personal development. And so I was like, well, how can I marry those in some way that makes sense? And so I decided to create jewelry that has meaning. So I have 6 pieces that I'm launching with. Each one is like a specific message or wish for somebody, and they're beautiful and they mean something, and it integrates with my community, which is like I have a lot of people who, like me, have felt profoundly ashamed and like something is profoundly wrong with them and had no place to kind of voice that, either because they grew up in a culture that didn't encourage it, or just because of their own kind of fears or limitations. And I have found in all of my years with working with people, the true reason they don't get help is because they're ashamed or because they don't think it's possible for them.
Yes.
And I just think it's so important that those of us who have walked out of challenges take the time to share that with others. Mm-hmm. So Secret Keepers is really about helping people release the secrets that kind of burden them, but also once they do that and they heal and they grow, taking the time to share that with others. And really making an effort so that the cycle continues. And I love it so much. I have goosebumps talking about my own thing because it feels like, for me, it feels like a coming home.
Yeah. So I'm excited. I can't wait to see these 6 pieces that are coming up. And what does living an unconventional life mean to you?
I think what's interesting about that is I notice like I have a little bit of like to me, it's about living in a way that's congruent with your values. Yes. And that might look super conventional, right?
Yes, completely.
So I had this thought of like, I was like, yeah, unconventional life. And I live, I think by all standards, a very unconventional life. And I've noticed in I feels like weird, like I'm now in my mid-30s and I've noticed this voice in me that like has me longing for like certain things, and then I have this other voice that's like, that's so conventional, or like I'm like, it's like whatever you choose, like as long as it's congruent with your values and what you say matters, to me that's actually really unconventional. Like most people live so far away from what's true for them, in jobs that they hate, in relationships with people they don't even like. I mean, the thing that's been so stunning to me about people sharing with me is I'm like, oh my God, you spend your day doing something you don't believe in, and you go home to someone you can't communicate with. Mm-hmm. And that's actually conventional. And that to me is scary. So in a lot of kind of like traditional norms. So what I feel most excited about is people getting really clear about what matters to them, what they value and what's true, and then living in alignment with that, whatever that might be.
Yes.
To me, that's actually what's so outside the norm.
Yeah, so good. Alignment, in my opinion, is the biggest fuel for any fire. Emily Rosen, thank you so much for joining us.
Fun.
And for those that want to learn more about your work, Secret Keepers, what's the best way to get in touch and follow along?
EmilyJoyRosen.com, psychologyofeating.com. Those are my 2 home planets. Find me on social media, say hi. I respond with an emoji.
She cares.
I respond.
Really, like so always.
Eventually I'll respond and come say hi. Emily Joy Rosen.
Amazing. Emily, thank you so much. Unconventional Life family, thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.